In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create this procedural moon surface material. So after we create the procedural material, I'll show you how to join it together into this custom node group with these customizable values. So we have the scale to change the size of the entire material. Then we also just have texture scale 1, which is going to change a noise texture, and texture scale 2, which is going to change a Voronoi texture. Then we have some different colors here. So we just have color 1, which is kind of a gray color, and then color 2, which is this really dark color. And then we have this cool color brightness. So you can just kind of change this to make brighter or darker colors. Then we have this distortion value to make kind of those hills on the surface kind of distorted. And then we also have detail value 1. Then we also have this detail value 2. And then we also have detail 3. And this is like a bunch of tiny little bits of detail. Then we also have this hills height. So if you want to make those hills or bumps higher, you can kind of push them up. Then we also have the roughness of the material, and then we have the bump strength, and then we finally have the displacement strength to pop out the mesh. Now, as well as this moon surface material, there's also these different variations here, and these variations will be in the project files. So if you want to purchase this procedural material, then you'll also get these other variations. Now, I'll show you how to do this later in the video, but if I go into the node group, the variations are going to be changed with the Voronoi. So here on the Voronoi, there's all these settings here, like the F2 and the distance to edge, and these other settings here. And so these settings are changed to make some different variations. So we have this moon surface Chebyshev here. So you can see that looks a lot different because of the Voronoi setting. We also have this one, which is smooth F1. Then we also have this one, which is the Minkowski. So that's another cool variation. Then we also have the Manhattan here. So that looks a bit different. Then we also have this distance to edge, and this one is like a really chunky one with some big hills and mountains. And then we also have the Minkowski F2, and that is a bit more of a flat one with some little cracks. So if you'd like to help support the channel and purchase this procedural material, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. Now, every time I create 10 more procedural materials, I create a Blender procedural material pack, which has the new 10 materials. So I've just released Blender procedural material pack 20, which comes with my 10 most recent materials. So you can check out that material pack with the link in the description if you're interested. Now, I also have a product called my Ultimate Blender procedural material pack, and my Ultimate material pack comes with all of my procedural materials, and they're all pre-set up for Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. And every time I create another 10 procedural materials, I also update the Ultimate material pack with all the new materials. So these new materials have been added to my Ultimate procedural material pack, so all of my existing customers can re-download the product files to get the new updates with the new materials. And to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. The links are all in the description. So I'll now show you the 3D setup if you want to set up the blend file the same way that I have. So I went to the add menu and I wanted to preview this material on a sphere. So I'm just going to add an icosphere, and then right behind me on the add icosphere settings, I'm going to turn the subdivisions up to 6 so it is nice and smooth and round. And also by turning it up to 6, the displacements will have more geometry to pop out the mesh. And then I'll use the object context menu and shade it smooth. Then I'm going to scale this object down a bit, so I'll scale it down to a 0.31, and then I'll press Ctrl A and I will apply the scale. And then I also went to the add menu and I wanted to preview this on a plane to see how it would look like on a ground object. So I added a plane, and I'll go into edit mode, and then I'll use the object context menu and I'll click on subdivide. You can also press Ctrl E and then click on subdivide. And I'm going to continue to do that many times until it is pretty detailed. So it has lots of geometry, so the displacements have lots of geometry to pop out the mesh. And then in object mode, I'll scale this object down to a 0.45, and I'll press Ctrl A and apply the scale, and I can kind of move these objects here into the center. Then I also added a camera, and I just pointed the camera at the objects. And if you select the camera and click here on the object data properties of the camera, I turn the focal length to 80 just to kind of zoom the camera in a bit. Now, as for the lighting, I added this area light right here, and on the area light settings here, I set the shape to rectangle, and then I changed the Y size to kind of make it longer, and I just have this pointed kind of on the side of the sphere. I also turn the power up to 40. If I go into the rendered viewport mode, it's just going to give some nice bright lighting to the side, and then I also duplicated the area light and made a bigger one, and for this one I turned the power to 80 and kind of had it here on the side to give some light to this plane. Now also here on the world properties, I added in this Canon HDRI. So this is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com, and I'll have the link in the video description if you'd like to download it. And I downloaded the 1K version and the HDR version. So to add in the HDRI, you can click on the yellow dot here next to color, you can click on environment texture, and then just click on the open button and open up the HDRI. And I also turned the strength of the HDRI down to 0.6 so it's a bit less bright. And then let's go over a few of the settings. So if I go up here to the render properties, I am using the Cycles rendering engine because I'm using the material displacements, and material displacements don't work in Eevee, they only work in Cycles. And then also, if I open up the film tab right here, I turned on the transparent button just so the background is transparent. And also here on the color management, I turned the view transform to filmic and the look to very high contrast. So I'm in the shading workspace, so I have the 3D viewport right over here, and I'm in the rendered mode, and I have the shader editor right over here, so I'll just minimize the side panel, and I'll click on new to add a new material, and I can rename it to Moon Surface. And I can click and drag and drop the material onto this object so they both have the same material. And then I'll also be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes, so if you don't have the Node Wrangler enabled, you can click on Edit, you can go to the Preferences, and over here in the Add-ons tab, if you go to the search, you can just search for Node Wrangler and just enable the Node Wrangler add-on so it's built into Blender, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So now we can create the material, and I'm going to start off by adding a noise texture. So I'll go to the Add menu and I'll search for a noise texture, and let's just drop it here. And with the noise texture selected, I'll press Ctrl T to add the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. And that's using the feature of the Node Wrangler add-on. Now also, if I hold down the Ctrl and Shift key and select different nodes, that's going to preview the node on the object. So I'll Ctrl Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. And then I want to use the object coordinates, so we'll put the object into the vector of the mapping, and that way it'll place the texture on the object more evenly. Now I also want to keep my nodes nicely organized because this will get a little bit complex. So I'm going to box select these nodes, and I'll press Ctrl J, and that will join them together into a frame. And if I select the frame and press F2 to add a label, I can call this mapping. So this is totally optional, I'm just using it to keep the nodes nicely organized. So now we can change some of the noise texture settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to 23, and I'll turn the detail all the way up to 15, and I'll turn the roughness to 8.56 just so it's a bit more detailed. Now later on in the custom node group, I want a value which is going to make the colors lighter or darker. So I'll go to the Add menu and I'll search for a hue saturation value, and I'll put this after the noise texture. So now this value, we can make it lighter or darker, and we'll be using that later in the custom node group. So we'll box select these nodes, I'll press Ctrl J to add a frame, and I can select the frame, and I'll press F2 to add a label, and I can just call this like noise. So the next group of textures that I want to create is the hills or the surface. So to do this, I'll start by going to the Add menu, and we'll add a noise texture. We'll put this here, and the vector mapping can go into the vector of the noise texture. And let's Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. And I can change some of the settings. So I'll leave the scale at 5, but I'll turn the detail to the max of 15, and then the other settings I'll leave how they are. So then what I also want to do is add a Voronoi texture after the noise, and we're going to have the noise distort the Voronoi to give it more detail. So I'll go to the Add menu, we'll search for a Voronoi texture, and we'll put it after the noise texture. And now let's change some of the Voronoi settings. So Control Shift and select the Voronoi. So I'll turn the scale here to 6, but then I'm going to leave all the other settings how they are. But then what I want to do between the noise and the Voronoi is go to the Add menu, and we're going to search for a mix color, and we'll put this between the noise and the Voronoi. And we're going to use this to have more control over how much the noise affects the Voronoi. So we're going to mix the noise with the original mapping, which isn't distorted. So we'll put this vector here from the mapping into color A, and then we're going to take this noise factor and we're going to put that into color B. Now on the mix type right here, we're going to click on this, and we're going to change it to the linear light instead. And now I can drag this factor around, and you can see that's going to distort it more or less. So I'm going to turn the factor to a 0.17, just a 0.17. So now it's more distorted and it looks more interesting. You can kind of start to see there's these dark areas and there's the light areas kind of with these little crack looks. And that's what we're going to use to create the base texture. And then later on in the custom node group, I want to be able to control the height of those hills. So if we go to the Add menu, we can search for a hue saturation value, and we'll put this after the Voronoi. Now the hue saturation value has this value here which makes it lighter and darker, and so later in the custom node group, the lighter and darker values are going to control how much the hills are popping up and down. And then I also want to add a color ramp just to change some of the colors. So I'll go to the add menu and I'll search for a color ramp. We'll put this here, and the color ramp, we want to put this after the hue saturation value, and then we can change the colors. So if you want to use the same exact color, I'm going to make this tab here kind of like a light gray, and the hex value of this color is going to be 838383. So that's going to be a bit brighter, and that'll be better for when we put that into the displacement. That's a better color value. So we can box select these nodes. I'll press Ctrl J to add a frame. I can press F2 to add a label, and I can call this hills, or you can call it surface, texture, or whatever you want to call it. So now I want to mix together the noise and the hills, and that way the hills will be a bit more noisy. So to do this, I will go to the add menu and I'll search for a mix color, and we can put the mix color here after the color ramp. And then we want this hue saturation value to be going into color B, and the color ramp color is going to go into color A. And then I can drag this factor around and that'll just evenly blend between them. But I want to click on the mix type here, and I want to change this to the linear light. So now when I drag this, you can still see the other texture, but it kind of looks like this noise is sort of distorting it and making it more noisy. And I'll turn this to a very small number of a 0.127. So just a 0.127, so just a little bit more noise. And we can also change this later if we want to customize the material. So now I want to add the main base colors. So I'll duplicate this linear light and I'll stick it here after this one. And this one here, I'm going to change the blending mode just back to mix. And this result can go into the factor. So by putting it into the factor, the light and dark values are going to determine what parts are going to be color A and what parts are going to be color B. So now I can make the two colors. So for color A, it's going to be kind of like a dark gray, and for color B it's going to be a very dark gray. And if you want to use the exact same colors I'm using, for color A the hex value is going to be 555452, and color B here, this is going to be a hex value of 191717. So now this mixed result here can go into the base color of the principled shader, and I can Control Shift and select the principled shader, and let's just drag these over here. So that's going to be the base color. Of course, it doesn't look very interesting right now, but we're going to add some values into the normal and the displacement to give it some more bump. Let's also make the roughness, because right now it is a little bit too shiny, so I want to turn that roughness up, but I want to have a slight variation between what parts are rough and what parts are shiny. So what I'm going to do is go to the add menu and we'll search for a color ramp. I'm just going to use the color ramp to kind of change the colors so we can make it more rough or more shiny. And this color ramp color, this is going to go into the factor of the color ramp, and then the color ramp color can go into the roughness. So now we can change the colors. So if I click on the black tab here on the color ramp, if I make it lighter, you can see everything's going to be more rough, but if it's darker, things will be more shiny. So I'm going to make it kind of like a light gray, because this should be a pretty rough material. And the hex value for this light gray color here will be DE. So it's just pretty light, and so that way it looks pretty rough because it's kind of a rocky surface. But then later on in the custom node group, I want to be able to change the roughness values as a customizable value. So if we go to the add menu, we can search for another hue saturation value, and I'll put this here after the color ramp, and this has a value which I can turn up and down, and you can see that's going to make it more shiny or more rough. So we can use that later in the custom node group. So we'll box select these nodes and give them a frame, and we can add a label to the frame, and I can call this roughness. And then also we can box select these nodes and add a frame just like before. Maybe I'll move this over, and we can give this a label, and I'll just call this color, or you can also call it base color. Now I do want to change the colors just a little bit to make them a little bit more sharp. So what I'll do is go to the add menu, and I'm going to search for a map range node, and we'll put this after the linear light, but before this mix here. So just stick it right in there. And then we can change a few of the colors here. So on the from min, I'll turn this to a 0.2. And then also let's change the from max to a 0.63. Just a 0.63. And then just a couple things I want to do to fix this, because you can see right now it's kind of lost a lot of detail, and there's just kind of these clumpy areas where it's lighter. So on the map range here, I don't want to clamp this, so I want to turn this off. And then if I go right down here to the Voronoi texture here, I do want to turn on the normalize. So by doing that, now you can see that kind of the tops of those hills there, or those cracks, are a bit darker, and there's also a lot more of that noise detail, so that looks a lot better. So now to make this look much more interesting, let's add the bump and the displacement. So I'll go to the add menu and I'm going to search for a bump node. We'll drop this down here. And then what I'm going to do is take this map range result and I can put this value into the height value of the bump. If I control shift and select the bump to preview it, you can see this is what it's doing. So it's converting that black and white data into bump data. So now the normal can go into the normal, the shader, and I can control shift and select the principled shader. So you can see it looks really bumpy right now, but that's way too strong. So I'll just turn the strength down to like a 0.1. Now I want to add 2 more layers of bump to make it look more bumpy. So I'll press Shift D to duplicate the bump, and I'm going to duplicate this bump 2 more times. And we're going to put the normal into the normal of this one, and the normal into the normal of this one. So we now have these 2 extra height values that we can plug data into. So let's take this color imp color here, and I'm going to put this into the height value to give it more bump data. So you can see now those sharp parts there of the hills look even more bumpy because we're using that color ramp. So that's what that one is doing. And then for this one here, I want to go up here to this noise and I'll take the hue saturation value and I'll put that into the height value. So we have this one here, and then this one here adding even more detail, and then this one here adding even more detail. So I can control shift and select the principled shader. You can see it looks nice and bumpy now on the surface. I'll box select these nodes and join them into a frame, and I'll add a label and I can just call this bump. Now to really make this stand out and to really make it look interesting, I'm going to add the displacement. So for the displacement, we're going to use this color amp color here, and we can put the color into the displacement. Now, if it's not looking correct and if it's not actually popping out, there's a few things that you need to do. One thing that you need to do, if you go here to the side panel, you need to make sure you're using the Cycles rendering engine because Eevee doesn't support the material displacements. Now, what you also need to do is add the displacement node because this here is color data, but then this here is displacement data. So you can see this is a purple dot, but this over here, this is a yellow dot. So we need to convert it to the correct data. So I'll go to the add menu and I'll search for the displacement and we'll put this here after the color ramp. So stick it there and I can drag this down here, and we actually want this value to be going into the height value of the displacement. So you can see it looks kind of bumpy, but it's not actually popping out the mesh is still flat. That's because we need to go to the material settings and we need to open up the settings, and on the displacement here, we want to change the bump only to displacement and bump so it is actually using the displacement. So now you can see it's really sharp and bumpy, so we can turn the scale down. So I'm going to turn this scale down to a 0.12 so it's less strong. And you can kind of play around with this to get it the strength that you like, but now the material looks much more interesting. So that is it for the finished procedural material. Now there is something you can do which is really cool to add more variation. So on this Vorno here, you can change the F1, so you can change this to the F2, that's kind of interesting. There's also smooth F1. There's also distance to edge, and then I don't think the end sphere radius really looks that good. That one doesn't really look that good. It actually unconnects the node. I could plug the radius here into the color. That looks a little bit interesting, but it's kind of weird and kind of too sharp on the edges. So I'm going to change this back to F1, but you can change those values there to make it more interesting. I need to put the distance again into the color. And then the other one that you can change to add more variation and to get kind of a different looking material is this bottom one here. So there's the Edlucian, there's also the Manhattan, and the Chebyshev, and also the Minkowski. So you can play around with both of these values to get some really interesting results, but I'll leave it to the top one here for now. So that's it for the procedural material, but I'll now show you how to join this together into a custom node group. So I'll click and drag to box select all the nodes except the material output, and I'll press Ctrl G to join it together into a node group, and you can hit the tab key to go in and out of the node group. So I'll go out of the node group and I'll drag it over here. Let's zoom in here, drag it over, and I'm going to copy the material name and I'll paste it here into the node group. And I'll hit the tab key to go into the node group, and I'll hit the N key to open up the side panel. And if you go to the group here, you can double click on this BSDF, and I want to rename this to shader just because I like that better. So now over here on this side, you can take the group input and you can plug values up to the group input to control them outside of the node group. So I'll plug the scale here from the mapping up to the extra socket here, and this scale value is plugged up to all the textures, so it'll control the size of the entire material. Now I want to click on the scale here and I'll change the type here from vector to float, and that will make it 1 value instead of 3. And then on the default value, I'll turn this to 1, and then I need to go outside of the node group and I'll turn the scale back to 1. So let's go back into the node group. And then I want to control the texture scale, so I'll drag the group input down here, and we can take the noise texture scale and I can put that into the extra socket, and also this Voronoi scale, put that into the extra socket. And then here I'll double click on them to rename them, and I'll rename this to texture scale 1, and then this one here is going to be texture scale 2. And then I want to control the colors, so I'll drag the group input right up here, and we can take this mix color here. We'll take color A, put that into the extra socket, and color B, we'll put that into the extra socket, and I'll double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename this to color 1, and then also color 2. And then I want to control the color brightness, so I'll drag the group input back here, and we have this value here which is going to make the noise lighter or darker, so I'll put the value into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to color brightness. Then I want to control the distortion, so if I drag this back over here, we have this linear light which is between the noise and the Voronoi, and this is going to make it more or less distorted. So I'll plug the factor into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to distortion right here. Then I want to control some detail values, so I'll drag this right down here behind the noise, and we can take the noise texture detail and I'll put that into the extra socket. And then I can also take this Voronoi detail, we'll put that into the extra socket, and then also this roughness right here, this noise texture roughness, this is also going to make it more and less detailed, so I'll put this roughness into the extra socket. And actually this roughness value right here, I want to click and drag up and then let go to drop it up here, so we have the detail, the roughness, and the detail. So I'll double click on these to rename them. I'll rename this one to detail 1, this one here is going to be detail 2, and this one will be detail 3. And then I want to control the hills height, so this hue saturation value is going to make the texture lighter and darker, and that'll control the hills height, so the value can go into the extra socket, and I can rename this to hills height. And then I want to control the roughness of the material, so let's drag the group input over here, and we have this hue saturation value that's going into the roughness, so the value will make the colors lighter or darker, which will in turn control the roughness. So I'll put the value into the extra socket, and we'll rename this to roughness. Now I also want to control the bump strengths, and you could put all of these individually into the sockets, but just to make the node a little bit more simple, I'm going to put all of them into the same socket because they're all the same value of 0.1. So we'll put this strength in here, and then this strength into the same socket, and this strength here into the same exact socket. And I can double click on this to rename it, and I'll call it bump strength. And then finally, we want to add the displacement strength to control how much the mesh is popping out. So I'll put the scale here from the displacement into the extra socket, and I'll rename this to displacement strength. So I'll drag the group input right back here. We can hit the N key to close the side panel, and we can hit the Tab key to go outside the node group. And we can now review the final material. So we have the scale value to change the size of the material. Then we have texture scale 1 and texture scale 2 to add variation. And then we have the different colors, so colors 1 and 2. And then we have the color brightness, that'll add more variation. We also have this cool distortion value to make it look more chunky or kind of a bit more smooth. We also have detail value 1, and we also have detail value 2, that's like some really small detail, and detail value 3. Then we have the hills height to pop out the hills. We also have the roughness of the material and the bump strength, and then finally the displacement strength to pop out the mesh. So that's going to be it for this video, so I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and thank you for watching. And you can also purchase this procedural material on my Gumroad store and Patreon page, so if you're interested, I'll have the links to that in the description. And I've also made another 10 procedural materials, so I've also updated my Ultimate Blender procedural material pack with all of these 10 new materials, so all of my existing customers can re-download the product files to get the updates with the new materials. And I've also released Blender Procedural Material Pack 20, which just come with my 10 most recent materials, so if you'd like to check that out, again, the link is in the description. You can also purchase any of my materials individually on my Gumroad store, and to learn how to create any of my materials, definitely check out my Blender Procedural Material Tutorial playlist here on my YouTube channel. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you for watching.